You're not Steve Jobs coming back to Apple and figuring out of the 19 products, which one to cut. You probably are not faced with that decision, right? You probably need to pick a vendor, and you're stressed out about like, is the president gonna be on your side eventually when he sees that it's gonna cost him 100,000 a year, or who to fire or who not to fire, and how to restructure the company. Yeah, so it's a big passion of mine. Like I've been painting for about 2.5 years now, and I love it. I wish I could paint more. So my end of life plan is actually very simple. It's just get a space, put up a big studio, travel the world, buy art, sell art, paint, and have a sort of some sort of like a residency program where if I meet artists across the world that I think are really good, I can actually invite them over to just come paint in the studio and we can sell their artwork for them. Yeah, so that's the plan. It might start way before then because I actually want to do a little. I have an idea for a small business slash art experience that me and my daughter want to put together. She's only 7 and she's excited about it. She's a real artist. I'm not. She's a real artist.
That is so cool and really cool that you can make it a family legacy.
She's been asking me every week since I brought it up.
I love how painting, especially with you were showing me earlier the tools and talking about the tools that you use. Not always the traditional paintbrush. There's so many different ways we can be resourceful and use what we have in our house, or do something makeshift to create. You don't have to have necessarily like all the expensive stuff or wait until you have the complete setup. You can get started now with what you have around you.
Yeah, and I mean, that translates perfectly over to business too, right? My paint store was the dollar store when I got started. Like, I would go to the dollar store and I would grab as much paint as I can. And I just started off there and graduated over time. And I started going to Michael's and all these more traditional craft and art stores, and they got more expensive paint over time. But I was like, I'm not even going to wait. I'm just going to grab what I can. These are just throwaways. I'm just getting started. And over time, I migrated to more expensive paints.
I think there's a lot of room for leaders to be creative. I'm excited for us to chat because you and I met in an agile course. It's probably almost a full year. We took a Friday night, like 4 hour quick certification course, really great material. I'm sure we are both still using a lot of what we learned from that. I know I am. Even better, when I take any of those courses or any kind of networking connection opportunity, I love finding the folks who I resonate with, and especially when it comes to leadership and management, and how can we connect and either share our resources or what we're doing. And you've been a great connection and friend in that way, Adrian. And I'm sure we'll talk a lot about a lot. But, when it comes to being resourceful and being a leader, what are some of those tools that you've had to find and pull together as a leader in your field?
Oh, no, so I had the perfect answer for you actually when you asked me the question first, because I like to think of leadership as a structure, right? And there's some foundation, right? And then you build on that. And sometimes we have folks that are leaders by title, but don't have some structural foundation that you need for leadership. And so when you asked me that question, I was like, immediately, first place my man ran was the most important thing to me is my philosophy, stoicism, right? So I ground myself in that because what that does for me, and over the past few years of studying and practicing, it allows me to look at situations for what they actually are, just situation, a collection of events, and slowly remove my emotion from that to be able to actually analyze the situation. I think as leaders, that's something that you have to practice, whether you call it stoicism, emotional control, emotional management, situational awareness, right? But being able to remove yourself from what's happening to actually understand what's going on, get the facts, get different perspectives, orient everybody towards a goal, and actually move people in that direction. And if you're emotionally all over the place, it's going to be really hard. And I think some of the toughest, and I go air quotes, leaders I've worked with are the ones where their emotion is right up front, right? Like that's the thing that's leading everybody. So the first tool and the most important tool in my framework, right, on my toolbox, I would say, would be stoicism and being able to actually control and regulate your emotions depending on what's going on, regardless of what's going on.
I love that. Is there a particular tenet or stoic? Marcus Aurelius, one of the most famous, comes to mind, but any quote that you come to or like to remind yourself often to kind of ground yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not going to be able to, I'm going to paraphrase here, but and I think I alluded to this earlier actually. Events are just that, right? They're a collection of things happening. Your perspective, the lens that you view events through gives it meaning, right? So you might not be able to control the actual events, but you control A, how you experience them, B, how you perceive them, and C, how you act, right? And I think the combination of that is one of the things that I always remember. It's okay, these are just events, right? What are the facts, right? What's true and what's not true, right? What's the objective reality of what's happening? And then I go from there. Easier said than done, don't get me wrong, right? Like I'm not a robot, right? Like even ChatGPT, I'm sure has emotion at this point. It's not AGI yet, right? So maybe not. But I'm pretty close to being able to remove myself in most situations at this point.
I think the art behind you that you created is a good testament to the fact that you do have emotion and empathy, and we can.
Right. Nice. There's right in there somewhere. Where is it? This way. Here we go.
Yeah, we can strike that balance. I like to think of it too as faith and reason. And it's not, I heard a commencement speaker say this recently, it's not simply faith or just reason, but we can have a balance of the two. And I would add in creativity into that mix. It doesn't mean that we're void of empathy, but I actually would say being able to see things for what they are and approach an event, if you will, through a different lens gives you the opportunity for more empathy because you can look at something from different angles.
Well, what are some of the common tools that people mention when you ask this question?
Self awareness is, I think, the biggest one, which I agree with.
One of the biggest foundations of it too, right? It's like just know thyself, right? Understand yourself. Yeah.
I would say the other one is communication, just how we communicate, but how it's being received is also important. And that what I would say is either a close second to what people talk about, or it's on par with the self-awareness, and having that as a leader is so crucial. And then I would say third is probably that empathy element and being able to understand where other people might be coming from and feeling that empathy for a situation. You never know what people are struggling with. And so, tied to that is a sort of curiosity and taking a pause to ask questions versus simply assuming you know what is going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, I think those are pretty much in line. To that, I would add, um, I would say risk taking, understanding that like you're not always going to have all the facts, right? And perspectives are going to differ, but be bold enough to actually make a decision and stand by it. I think if you're asking about the leadership traits, to me, that's like number one, right? You should be able to do that.
But so nobody has brought that up before, and I love that. Is there advice for anyone that you could give to help them like know how how do I know when I'm taking a risk that is and maybe I shouldn't judge it, but good versus a bad risk. There is it a calculated risk, or are there some risks that are just very poor decisions masked as I'm a risk taker and I'm being really bold? You know what I'm getting at?
Yeah, and I've done both. I've been both ends of that spectrum. So I like to go back to Nassim Taleb here with his quote, which is avoid ruin, right? And it's so simple. It's like take risks, right? And in his book, what's the title of the book? I was reading it the other day, Skin in the Game, right? And he talks about like taking risks and having skin in the game, and that's how you actually become successful. You have to take risks. But on the other end, he's like avoid ruin at all costs, right? And so for me, the way I look at risk taking now is less of a daredevil of like, let's just figure it out and see what happens. But calculated risks where the calculation is not so much based around like, is this going to be successful? Am I going to get the outcome that I want? I think that's the wrong way to look at taking risks. The right way is to say, if this doesn't work, how bad is it going to get?
Mhm.
If you're going to tank the company, you better be sure that that's the last decision you have to make. But most of the decisions we have to make are not that. You're not Steve Jobs coming back to Apple and figuring out of the 19 products, which one to cut. You probably are not faced with that decision, right? You probably need to pick a vendor, and you're stressed out about like, is the president gonna be on your side eventually when he sees that it's gonna cost him 100,000 a year, or who to fire or who not to fire and how to restructure the company. But just protect the downside, right, as much as possible. And if you're not going to ruin things, then I think it's a risk worth taking, especially if there's upside that you can calculate and see that is worth it.
That's a great point. It reminds me of something I saw scrolling through Instagram the other day about decisions, and is the decision you're going to make irreversible, or can you redirect if it's not the right decision? That feels very much in line with what you're saying too. So I think that's a great kind of guide.
And I think what comes to mind right after you mentioned that is Scrum, right? Something that we all know very well. Well, we both know very well. I don't know about everybody else, that they should. But I also just thought about like another way to think about it is break decisions up into smaller chunks, right? It's not one big decision with everything in it, right? You're not at Chipotle saying, all right, I'll take everything, right? You sort of piecemeal it, right? Break it up, right? Restructure the entire org, right? Maybe let's start with like a low risk area first. Let's see how that goes, right? But I think that it's very reminiscent of like the 80s with project management where everything was an overhaul, right?
Mhm.
Nothing works. All right, let's overhaul the system, right? It's like everything's brand new and it's all going to work now. And none of those projects worked, right? Most of them failed. And so if you think about decision making as like a sort of a Scrum project, is you iterate, learn, and adapt over time versus one big decision.
Yeah, I love you bringing that up too, because it's the small incremental improvements that we can make, smaller decisions that we can work on throughout the day that compound and can make a huge difference.
Mhm.
Like you're saying, we're not all former CEOs and founders coming back to a company and making these really hard decisions. But I feel like maybe we approach decision making with hesitation, because as leaders, we have to make so many decisions that we get decision fatigue and we get tired, and the idea or the weight and the pressure of just making decisions can be so much that it feels more monumental than it actually is. And I wonder, how do you take care of yourself as a leader in those moments so that you can see a little bit more of the clearer perspective of where you are in the moment versus the compounding pressure of the day or of the quarter?
So that's a brilliant question, actually. And I think with all your questions, my mind just goes, okay, I don't know the answer to that because it's just there. I've experienced it. So with this one, so there's sort of two things, right? One is the pressures of decision are only really felt, right, in an environment that's not psychologically safe, right? And so, yes, you have to make big decisions, but if that environment is psychologically safe for you as a leader, your confidence goes sky high, right? Because you understand the environment that you're in, that yes, people are understanding, you have a good team, there's a good culture, right? And so making those decisions come a little easier knowing that, okay, you know what? Our culture here is one that we're risk takers, we're calculated risk takers, we talk things through, right? We protect the downside, but then we go for it. And the most important thing there is that if we don't necessarily hit the target, we have a system where we can learn from that and course correct, right? But that can only exist in environments that are psychologically safe, right? And I know the toxic workplace is part of the lexicon now and everybody's talking about it, but that's very real. It really does affect your ability to lead or not because you're always looking up, right? And if people get the beat down when things don't go as planned, you're likely not going to take the decisions or make the decisions that actually are going to benefit the organization in a positive way. So you're always going to take smaller risks, smaller bets that are always sort of sure things versus the things that are actually going to move the needle. Now, in an environment where you don't have psychological safety, and I think alluding to your question, is how do you create a space for yourself where you can be psychologically safe in an environment that's not psychologically safe? First thing I would say, I'm quite brutal about this now. If you're in a space that's not psychologically safe, you should be polishing up your resume and looking at the door, right? Because that's no way to live, first of all, right? Let's just keep it real. Secondly, if you must stay in that environment, then I think at that point you need to practice as much self care as possible, right? Clearly communicating, clear documentation, ensuring that you are leading to the best of your ability, understanding that, hey, you have limitations, understanding that you can't control everything around you, and understanding the situation and the environment that you're in, and sort of being at peace with that whilst planning to leave, right? Everything I'm saying now is just like is just to manage the situation, right? And if it's not a long-term fix, right? So you want to be in an environment where you're allowed to fail, right? And you see this with development of children too. You know, kids that when they were little, like they couldn't drop anything, they got yelled at, right? Or they couldn't make a mess, they got yelled at, or they got spanked. They grow up to be adults that are risk averse, right? The kids that are out there dropping things and mom's, oh, it's fine, we'll just clean it up, it's just stuff, right? Or they'll break things. Those kids become the creative ones, right? And so it's from childhood, it can be something that really affects us. It doesn't really stop. As adults, we're very much we like praise. We like to know that, hey, people got our backs. We like to know that we're part of a team. It doesn't really change. And I think that that's the number one thing I would say.
That's a great point. I've had a couple of conversations with folks too who've talked about how the sort of conditioning that we carry with us from childhood can affect whether we're in a psychologically safe environment or not, can affect how we navigate through those situations. And so someone who has come from that background might even be in a very safe environment and still feel like they can't take any of those calculated risks because of their past experience. And even for someone like myself, who I call myself a recovering perfectionist, and I know that comes from childhood and certain experiences that I had growing up, and having to decondition and kind of do the personal internal work to let go of some of that perfectionism and strike the balance. I know how challenging that can be when you're in both a toxic environment and then when you find an environment where testing and experimentation and figuring things out and creativity is admired, you can still pull on a little bit of that. And so that's why I feel like for folks who are leaders of other people, especially, we have to be able to recognize that people are coming from those different backgrounds. And you have to continue the work of making people feel safe and the ability to able to take those decisions and run with them and try new things with guardrails. Keep in mind, there's still need to be some guardrails at times, but I feel like it's really important for us to still have that awareness and not take for granted that, well, we're in a safe environment and people know that I like when they try new things. I feel like we still have to really work at that as a society, probably, and definitely as leaders of teams.
So there's two things that you said that really stood out to me. One was ownership. And to go back to your previous question, I think it's easier to make big decisions if you feel like you own that decision, right? And creating that environment is obviously cultural as well. Where do you have, there's a book, one of my favorite books is actually called Extreme Ownership. Have you read that? You have? Oh, yeah, 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 yeah. So like if you feel like you own something, and you don't have to physically own the company to feel like you own your work, right? That's the job of your leaders above, right? Creating the culture of ownership because, share the work, share the ownership, right? You might have some issues there, but if people feel like they actually own their work, they can stand behind decisions a little bit more sturdy than if they feel like I don't really own this, so I'll just defer to somebody else every time. And then the second thing you mentioned is I'm not too sure you even realize this, but you said like how you lead people, and I think that like you can there's different types of leadership, right? Even when you're a leader, you have to sort of lead the vision, which is more strategic, directional, data driven, insights, creativity, but it's also leading people, which is understanding people. I think you alluded to that as well, which was, hey, you're not going to lead everybody the same way. right? Rebecca might be, nose to the grindstone kind of girly, right? You just load her up with work, tell her to do tomorrow, and she thrives, right? You might do that to somebody else and they completely have a breakdown, right? And so it's actually understanding your people, understanding what drives them, understanding what motivates them, understanding their dreams. Now, I'm not saying you guys should be friends, right? But definitely have conversations to the point where you sort of know what they care about. And I like to always say, speak their language, right? As a leader, that's the most important thing. Like, when I ran teams, there are inside jokes that I'll say to the scrum master that the business analyst wouldn't even like smile at. And so it's like I can't be the same with everybody. I have to really understand who I'm dealing with and ultimately what really motivates them, right? Because trust me, when you speak somebody's language, you can touch parts of them that internally that is very hard to reach, right? And you can motivate them in a way that inspires them, right? To view you as a leader. To that point, then you've created that foundation that I spoke about earlier to now push people to different places that they haven't been before. But without that, you just don't get that. You're just a micromanager. You're just aggressive with timelines and deadlines. But if I know how Rebecca ticks, right? I know if I tell her, certain words or phrases, or if I structure this project in a way that says, hey, look, I know you have a thing for systems. This is going to be a big one, right? How do you feel about it? Can you handle it? And then, oh yeah, yeah, I got it. Well, the deadlines are going to be pretty tight. You know what? Let me bring some more resources in. This person is a perfectionist, right? This person likes to own their work. They say, no, I got this. So now you've created the frame for them, right? Now it's a personal and a professional challenge at the same time. Then you let them go. That approach might not work for somebody else. And so it's really important to know your people.
I love that. A great reminder for all of us. And that's where your creativity also comes in too, Adrian, because you have to be able to draw on the different tools and resources you have to create the bigger picture, whatever that is. And so I like how you draw on that and remind us of that too. And then at the same time, it makes me wonder, we want to talk a little bit about innovation. Is that connected to creating an environment where people can be innovative and be a little bit more resourceful themselves? How do you instill that in a team?
Yeah. So I learned this from a 6 month leadership camp that I did years ago. I signed up for it. I thought it was all about business. Turns out it was more about just politics, right? And how to lead with on in the public sector. So I stuck around and I learned a tremendous amount. One of the phrases that really stood out to me at the time was know when to step up and step back.
Mm.
Right. And the reason they told us that, because it was a room full of very ambitious millennials, right? And we had to do all these projects and somebody had to lead. Those conversations initially were pretty tough, right? And so it's okay, everybody pause. We got to teach you guys something, right? So understand when to step up and step back. And so when it comes to innovation, I kind of view it the same, right? You step up, right, and create the environment for innovation, and then you step back and let the void be filled up by the team, right? So with the Scrum Master certification, we were taught as a Scrum Master, when you get into a meeting, you just kind of be quiet. And you say, does anybody want to start? And that's all you say, and you step back. Because what you want the team to do is to self-organize. And the most critical thing about that question and that process is that the Scrum Master doesn't cave, right? If you go into a meeting and you say, does anybody want to start? And you turn your mic off, the success of that framework or that process is dependent on whether or not you turn back on your mic and start speaking if nobody says something, right? So now it's a game of cat and mouse, right? So you just sit there and you wait. Minute goes by, it's awkward. 2 minutes, three, four, it's getting really awkward now. And then the lead dev or the tech lead says, you know what? Okay, so I'll start. Now you've been successful.
Yeah.
Innovation is the same. If you constantly show up and you've got all the ideas and you're brainstorming and driving everybody, people will always defer to you. But if you do that a couple of times, set the environment of how the flavor du jour of how you like innovation, right? You lead with that, and you step up and you step back and let that void be filled by the team, you have to just be able to sit there and just not interfere with people figuring it out. And if you do interfere, what you've done is you've stifled innovation successfully, right? So being able to set the environment, right? Teach people how it's supposed to be done, and then step back and just mind your business, right? Let the team, employees do what they need to do to figure it out. They're going to stumble over themselves. It's going to be hard. You want to jump in, but you have to stay back.
How do you know if you are absolutely needed to step in at any point? Or is there a point? Let me start with that. Is there a point ever when you have to jump in and maybe provide a little bit of guidance or structure?
That's a really good question. And I think this is where people often go off the rails, because there's nothing worse off than somebody trying to figure something out. They're almost there, they're learning, they're iterating, they're getting there, and suddenly you jump in and fix it. What you've done is you've robbed that individual or that team of the opportunity to learn something and discover something for themselves. So, in my honest opinion, your question was, when do you know it's time to jump in? When you're asked.
That's a great one. That is a great point. Yeah.
You know, when my daughter is trying to figure something out and I say, do you need some help? She said, no, I got it. And the piece looks like it's upside down, and I just say, okay, I guess you got it, and I'll just walk away. Eventually I hear, da da, need some help over here. Then I'm ready, right? I've been called. And so as a leader, it's the same, right? Like, you just wait until you're asked.
I love that. Adrian, you're so full of great value and wisdom. What is something that you would tell yourself, when you were just starting out your career, or when you first started maybe managing and leading people, not necessarily projects, but actually working and guiding with people? What's something you wish you knew then that you know now?
This is a hard one to answer, because I feel like I understood that back then, but not as much as I do now. Because naturally, there's a lot more years. So I'm going to flip the question a little bit and say, yes, I understood this back then, but I didn't realize the gravity of it until like now. And I'm pretty sure I'm going to learn more about this in the future. And it's the reality, whether you like it or not, that life is about people, right? And this work thing that we do, the innovation, the projects, and all this stuff, it is really an opportunity to engage with other humans in just a different format. Right? We have our personal lives, we have our professional lives, and they give us different opportunities to explore and experience people, right, doing different things together. And ultimately, that's the prelude to just really understand that work is just really work, right? And what we really are here to do is to build relationships that are going to come back and enrich our lives, or in the moment enrich our lives. The people I've worked with, there's this guy I worked with fresh out of college, and he was an old engineer. You won't like me calling him that, but and when it was like four or five of us in the office, and all he did all day was work at his computer and just talk, right? And I would just listen. He was so wise. And I just soaked up all his knowledge and wisdom. I would ask him questions here and there, but he would just talk. He would literally just talk. And I looked forward to work every day, because I would get down, sit in I didn't need music. I didn't need headphones. I had live entertainment. And he would just tell me stories, wisdom, tips, and tricks that enrich my life till this day. And so that experience, yes, it was about work and we did some really cool stuff, but I experienced him as a person as well. And so with every step and everything we do in the professional world, business world, don't take your eye off the opportunity to engage with humans at a very human level. Because oftentimes that can get lost and we get buried in the work and think the work is the most important thing. Yes, it is important. We're getting paid to do that. Absolutely. But we have this massive opportunity to experience somebody else and build relationships that will last. And how this can manifest itself in ways that really almost like upset me is when people are working with coworkers and they don't know them, right? They just know them as like, hey, I go to gym for accounting stuff. And it's like, Jim could have knowledge that'll change your life, but you've never asked him, hey man, let's go grab lunch. Heard you just had a baby, right? You need anything, right? Just do the human thing, right? And so I think that's the one thing that comes to mind. I understood it back then, but 15 years later now, I'm like, well, that's really important.
You're right. It can be so easy to just kind of hunker down and focus on the work, and it can become all consuming. But I love your reminder that, what are we here to do? Hopefully our work is here to help other people, whether they're someone we're working alongside or there's someone who's going to benefit from our work, benefit from our art, whatever it is that we're putting our hands and our minds to, people receive it or experience it or work alongside us. So I love that. And just kind of speaks back to what we're originally chatting about, and how I really love the connections that I've made from the different experiences, work or otherwise. And you engaging with me today, Adrian, and our audience has been really special. I feel like we need a part two. If I invite you back for a part two, would you say yes? No pressure that we're recording.
Just ask on air. Like, that's fine. So I mean, there's so much we can touch on, right? About innovation and philosophy and work and some of your frameworks, which I want to learn about too. So yeah, absolutely. I'll definitely come on again.